So now let us turn to the crucifixion account and the resurrection in Matthew 27 and 28. So these chapters tell Matthew's account of Christ's death and resurrection. We see that Jesus was handed over to Pontius Pilate for sentencing and for execution, since the Jewish authorities could not do this by themselves. Only the Roman authorities had the authority to do that. Meanwhile, Matthew is going to report that Christ's disciple and betrayer, Judas, wanted to reverse his crime. He was remorseful for his crime, and he returned the 30 pieces of silver that he had been paid. And of course, he was rebuked by the chief priest. He throws the silver into the temple, and he kills himself. And the priests then take his money and go and buy a field to bury strangers in, because they couldn't put the money back into the treasury. It was blood money. And so, but anyway, Pilate then goes on and sentences Christ to death by crucifixion, even though he was convinced personally of Jesus' innocence. And this is one of the reasons why Pilate gets his notorious name, is because he condemned an innocent man that he believed was innocent. He only did it for political expediency. The Jewish authorities were calling for Christ's death, and Pilate appeased them because they were determined to crucify him. They demanded death by crucifixion, and there's a reason why Jesus had to be crucified, and he couldn't have been put to death any other way that would have made the Jewish authorities happy. Okay? Crucifixion in Jewish culture, that is death by hanging naked on a tree, was a visual spectacle that proved that the person was accursed by God. And so if this man claimed to be the Son of God, how could he be the Son of God here hanging on the tree naked and disgraced this way? The Son of God would never be in this situation. And so they thought that crucifixion was a de facto evidence that he was not the Son of God. And so he dies there very quickly. And the Jews would have been right if Jesus had not resurrected from the dead. In other words, had he not resurrected from the dead, they would have been correct that he was not the Son of God. Paul as much says so in other places. Matthew describes Christ's crucifixion starting with a mockery of the soldiers who abuse him physically and verbally and come up with all manner of ways to ridicule him. Bringing him at noon to a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, just outside of Jerusalem, they began the crucifixion, nailing him to a cross between two thieves. The mockeries continue there, and there's an extraordinarily painful death, a fairly quick death for Christ, because he had been flogged. And so at Friday 3 in the afternoon, he dies, and this is associated with all kinds of natural events. And of course, Christ himself says that, it is finished, his work is finished here on earth. And so much theological and religious and spiritual content is packed into these events. But like I said, the resurrection itself is going to be the final rehabilitation of Christ's image for his followers. And so Matthew records all of these events coinciding with his death, and also the rending of the veil in the temple, it says. Now the temple separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, and so the rending of the veil implies at least that whatever it was that was separating people from God has been removed. It has been opened. Christ has opened the path to salvation for all. Okay? Now the burial of Christ and its details now follow in the Matthean account, and he records the burial in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy Sanhedrin who was probably a believer in Christ, okay? The location of the tomb was not in doubt after the resurrection. This was a brand new tomb. He was a wealthy man. He knew where his tomb was. And so no one lost the tomb. He wasn't buried in an accidental tomb and then forgotten, for example. But Matthew deals with a coming question over the resurrection by recording that the Jewish and the Roman authorities both desired to prevent a conspiracy. And they did so by posting Roman guards at the tomb and sealing the tomb. And so the Jewish authorities would have had a vested interest in preventing such a conspiracy, and the Roman authorities as well. On Sunday, the third day after his death, his disciples go to visit the tomb and they find it empty. And there are different accounts of exactly what transpired. They don't really contradict, they're just from different perspectives. But on Matthew's account, they saw angels that had announced to them that Christ has resurrected, and to look at the place where he had been buried to see that the tomb was empty. And many other experiences are going to emerge here. The guards were then bribed by the Jewish priests to say that Christ's body was stolen by his disciples. Okay, so there's a conspiracy that's going on here. There was a conspiracy by the Jews to create a conspiracy or make it look like that the disciples had created a conspiracy. So Matthew is dealing with what is called the conspiracy theory right up front. Okay. Now, the disciples had been instructed by the risen Christ to return to Galilee, and so they did, and there they encounter the risen Christ again, who tells them to spread the good news, the gospel, to all nations in the world.